What's one small thing someone did in your family that left a big scar?
I stood at the sink, scrubbing a wine glass that wasn't mine, listening to my dad tell the same story for the second time about how Jessica had always been a leader, even in kindergarten. And nobody seemed to notice that I hadn't spoken a full sentence in at least an hour. I just kept washing the dishes, one after another, like I was the caterer or the help or maybe some quiet neighbor who had wandered into the wrong house and decided to make herself useful while the real family celebrated in the dining room. They toasted her new role, director of client strategy at some marketing firm with a name that sounded like a law office, and when my mom stood up to clink her glass and added that we couldn't be prouder of our girl, she didn't even glance in my direction. Like there was only one daughter worth mentioning and the other one was just a logistical inconvenience who showed up out of obligation. I said nothing. Not because I didn't have words. I had plenty. But none of them would have landed right in that room, not that night. A few hours later, the house was quiet and Jessica, of all people, texted me from upstairs, "Why is Mom crying in her room?" And in that moment, with my hands still damp from scrubbing their celebration off a dozen porcelain plates, I realized the truth didn't need to be shouted to be heard. Let me tell you how we got here. Growing up, my sister was the kind of kid who made straight A's and reminded the teacher about homework and won essay contests sponsored by the local bank, and while I wasn't some screw-up or slacker, I was more the kind of student who did fine, kept to myself, and didn't really make noise, which, in our house, meant I was invisible. I didn't rebel, didn't sneak out, didn't cause problems, but somehow that didn't translate to praise. It just made me easy to forget. Jessica got a car at 16, brand new, red, and obnoxiously clean, while I was told there wasn't enough in the budget for me to even take the bus to campus my freshman year of college, so I walked most days, even in the rain, even with a sprained ankle. When I got my first full-time job at a local nonprofit, my dad asked me when I'd move on to something real. When Jessica got hired at a startup that folded 6 months later, they threw her a dinner to celebrate her leap of faith. By the time we were adults, I had given up trying to get noticed. I paid my rent on time, helped friends move, remembered everyone's birthday, and spent my Sundays calling Mom even when she barely asked about my week before pivoting the conversation back to what Jessica had accomplished lately. I knew my role, and I had accepted it, or at least I thought I had. When Mom sent out the invitation for Jessica's career milestone dinner, it wasn't even disguised as a general family gathering. It was clearly her night. I offered to bring dessert, and Mom said not to bother. She'd already asked Jessica to pick her favorite bakery. It was small, but it stuck. I bought a pie anyway. I put it in the fridge without saying anything. At the dinner, they talked about bonuses and health packages and business cards with embossed titles. Jessica joked that she might finally be the first millionaire in the family, and Dad raised his glass and said, "We always knew it would be you, sweetheart." I was sitting across from them, chewing silently, nodding when appropriate, smiling when expected. I didn't mention that I'd just finished managing a massive logistics campaign for a regional crisis center, or that my work had helped resettle over 200 displaced families. They wouldn't have cared. Or worse, they would have smiled politely and pivoted back to Jessica's new office view. And maybe I could have let it go, like I always had. Maybe I could have swallowed the bitterness, told myself it didn't matter, convinced myself I was above needing their validation. But when Dad leaned over to my uncle and said, with his voice half lowered, but not enough to keep it private, "Jess is the one who made something of herself. We just wanted both girls to succeed, but some people aren't built for that kind of pressure," I felt something crack. Not break, just crack, slow and quiet, like a seam forming under strain. So I stood up, said I'd get started on the cleanup, and walked my plate to the kitchen. No one followed. No one offered to help. From the clinking in the dining room, they probably didn't even notice I was gone. I washed the dishes. I stacked the forks. I packaged leftovers that weren't for me. And while I did all that, I thought about all the things they didn't know about Jessica, about me, about everything they had chosen not to see because it was easier to keep their perfect picture intact. And later that night, after the laughter died down and the wine wore off and the house finally quieted, I sent a single message to my sister. Just a sentence. Nothing cruel. Nothing angry. But enough. A few minutes passed. Then she texted me, "Why is Mom crying in her room?" And I locked my phone, dried my hands on a towel, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe I didn't need them to see me anymore. Because they finally saw her. There's something surreal about sitting at a table surrounded by people who share your blood, your history, your childhood memories, people who, on paper, are supposed to know you better than anyone else, and yet somehow, they act like you're a plus one someone forgot to uninvite. That night, as I sat there across from my sister, watching her glide through the conversation like a swan in clear water, while everyone else orbited around her like obedient planets, I realized this wasn't just about her promotion or the champagne or even the dinner. It was about the fact that I had never really been invited into their narrative to begin with. I wasn't a supporting character, not even a footnote. I was the person behind the curtain, holding up the backdrop, making sure the scene looked perfect from the front, all while being erased from the final script without so much as a mention in the credits. Jessica had always been like that, effortlessly magnetic in the way that made people lean in when she spoke, even if what she was saying was meaningless, even if it was just about the color of her new office chair or the perks that came with the title of director. And it wasn't even jealousy, not in the typical sense, because I didn't want her life, her job, her apartment with the high ceilings and overpriced throw pillows, or the boyfriend who looked like he talked about crypto at parties. What I wanted, what I had always quietly ached for, was acknowledgement, a moment, even half a moment, where someone would stop the conversation and turn to me and say, "And what about you?" But that night, like every night before it, wasn't built for me. The dinner table was set like a stage, and the performance began the moment we sat down. Mom had lit the good candles, the ones she only brought out on Thanksgiving or when one of Dad's clients came over, and Dad was already on his second glass of wine before the appetizers hit the table, which meant his compliments would be sloppier than usual, and the jokes would get louder as the evening wore on. Jessica, dressed in that effortless way she always managed, polished but casual, like someone who wanted you to think she just threw something on even though she'd spent over an hour getting ready, was already leading the conversation like a conductor, fielding questions, pausing for laughter, and pretending to be humble while she soaked in the applause. "I mean, it's not that big of a deal," she said, waving a hand like she wasn't fully aware that everyone in that room would have died to be able to say the words she just had. "I'll have a team of 12, but they're pretty independent. It's more about the strategy side now." 12 direct reports, Uncle Rick said, shaking his head like he'd just heard the winning lottery numbers. "That's real management. That's real power. You always had it in you." Mom smiled like she was watching a wedding ceremony, like her favorite daughter was walking down an aisle paved with recognition and framed certificates. "You were born to lead, sweetheart. Remember when you used to organize those neighborhood bake sales? You had spreadsheets before you could spell the word. No one asked me what I had been working on for the past 2 years. No one mentioned the fundraiser I had organized that brought in enough donations to cover 6 months of housing for women transitioning out of shelters. No one brought up that I had recently helped rewrite policy to improve access to social services for undocumented families. It didn't matter. It wasn't marketable, it wasn't shiny, it didn't come with a LinkedIn banner or a glass office door. It wasn't worthy of a toast. At some point, Jessica's boyfriend, Connor, or Carter, or some other name that sounds like it belongs to a guy who brags about golf even when no one asked, leaned over and said something about how she was a beast in the boardroom. And everyone laughed like it was the funniest thing anyone had said all night. I smiled too, because that's what I'd been trained to do. I smiled, and I nodded, and I poured more wine into everyone's glasses because it gave me something to do with my hands while my chest filled with that cold, sour feeling that never fully went away. Then, just as I thought we might finally move on to something neutral, maybe dessert, maybe the weather, maybe anything that didn't revolve around Jessica's resume, Dad clinked his glass with his knife and stood up, wobbling just slightly, and raised his voice. "Let's raise a glass," he said, already too loud, already too proud. "To Jessica, our shining star. The one who always knew where she was going. The one who never gave up. We couldn't be prouder." Here's to success, ambition, and making your dreams come true." Everyone raised their glasses. Everyone except me, because my hand was still in the kitchen, reaching for another stack of plates to clear. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Because while they were drinking to her future, I was already remembering her past. I was remembering the things she'd told me in confidence, the thing she probably assumed I'd forgotten, the thing no one at that table knew, not Mom, not Dad, not even Connor with a C. And maybe it wouldn't have mattered. Maybe I could have kept it tucked away, like so many other things I'd swallowed over the years. But as I stood at the kitchen doorway, half in the room and half out of it, listening to Jessica soak up every drop of praise like she'd earned it all alone, I realized something. They weren't just ignoring me. They were pretending I wasn't even real. And that was the moment something started to shift. Not loudly. Not all at once. Just enough to make me pause. Just enough to make me remember exactly what Jessica had told me 2 years ago, after one too many glasses of wine, when she needed someone to cover for her. That was the night she handed me the match. She just didn't know I'd kept it. There's something peculiar about how a person can go from calm to calculated in the span of a single sentence, especially when that sentence doesn't come from a stranger or an enemy or even a casual acquaintance, but from your own father. The man who used to carry you on his shoulders at county fairs, who once swore to the sky that he'd always believe in both his daughters equally, who, in the eyes of a child, seemed incapable of favoritism or cruelty, and yet, somehow, now stood in front of a dinner table of relatives and friends, clinking his wine glass with the kind of pride you'd expect at a retirement gala, before tilting his head toward his brother and muttering, "Well, at least one of them figured it out." He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. The tone said enough. The implication did the rest. And just like that, years of buried grace cracked like a fault line deep beneath the surface of my chest. I didn't react, not outwardly, not in any way they would have noticed, because I've learned that in families like mine, the ones built on selective memory and passive comparisons, the only thing worse than being invisible is being labeled difficult. And once that label sticks, you might as well move to another state because there's no coming back from it. So instead, I smiled again, nodded as if I hadn't heard, and excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of checking the dessert, even though the pie I'd brought, the one no one asked for, the one I knew they wouldn't serve because it wasn't Jessica's favorite, was still sitting in the fridge untouched, unnoticed, like me. It's strange what your mind does when it's finally done being polite. As I stood there by the sink, staring out the dark window, listening to the laughter and clinking glasses in the other room like background noise on a TV I didn't want to watch anymore, I started to remember every moment that led me to that exact point. Every small slight, every casual dismissal, every time I'd swallowed my pride just to keep the peace. I remembered my high school graduation, when Jessica got flowers and balloons and a framed scrapbook of her childhood, and I got a pat on the back and a "we're proud of you too, sweetie." I remembered the year I was laid off and couldn't afford Christmas gifts, and Mom suggested maybe I shouldn't come at all so I wouldn't feel embarrassed. I remembered the dozens of times I'd listened to Jessica's relationship problems, given her rides when her car broke down, lent her money when her card got declined, and covered for her when she didn't want our parents to know. She'd gotten fired from that PR job in Chicago after only 3 months. And that was the memory that stopped me cold, not because it hurt, but because it gave me leverage. Jessica had cried in my apartment that night, mascara streaked down her cheeks, practically begging me not to tell Mom and Dad because they wouldn't understand, and because she couldn't afford another blow to her image. She had blamed the boss, the commute, the company culture, everything except herself, and when she left, she promised she'd make it up to me, which, of course, she never did. She never brought it up again, never even thanked me for keeping her secret, never acknowledged the risk I took by pretending everything was fine. And that silence, I now realized, was her version of gratitude, a quiet expectation that I'd keep covering her tracks, forever, without question. But something shifted that night, something subtle and irreversible, because for the first time in years, I wasn't angry, I was awake. I was done playing my role as the shadow sibling, the emotional janitor cleaning up after the golden child's messes. I wasn't going to argue with them. I wasn't going to plead for recognition. I wasn't going to scream. I didn't need to. All I had to do was stop protecting her. That realization settled into my chest like a stone, not heavy, but solid, certain, and I walked back into that dining room with a smile that meant nothing at all. They were still laughing, passing around Jessica's LinkedIn profile on someone's phone like it was a birth announcement. She glanced up at me and gave that look, the look of someone who assumes your silence means admiration, the look of someone who thinks they've won, and I smiled right back because I had just remembered something else she'd told me during that same breakdown in Chicago. Something even bigger than the firing, something she had made me promise not to repeat, something that had the power to not just embarrass her, but fundamentally shift the way our parents saw her. It had been casual, almost flippant, like she just needed to say it out loud, that she hadn't really earned that last promotion, that she'd taken credit for a project her coworker had completed while he was out sick with COVID, that she'd massaged the data in the report because her manager didn't double-check the spreadsheets, and that when things started to fall apart, she jumped ship before anyone could notice. At the time, I had told her it was reckless and dishonest, but she laughed and said, "It's not about what's true. It's about what looks true." And she believed that. She really did. So when Dad made his toast and everyone clinked glasses and my name hadn't even been said once all night, I quietly picked up my phone, walked back into the kitchen, and stared at her contact for a long moment. I wasn't going to do anything loud or public or ugly. That wasn't my style. What I planned would be simple, quiet, and deeply effective. I wasn't going to destroy her. I was just going to take my silence off the table. Because the thing about being invisible for so long is that people forget you're still in the room. And when you finally stand up, they never see it coming. It's strange how power doesn't always come from yelling the loudest or pushing your way to the center of attention. Sometimes it lives in the moments where you keep your head down, listen a little too carefully. Remember the details other people think you're too passive to notice, and wait, not because you're weak, but because you understand that timing is everything when you've spent your whole life being underestimated. That night, as everyone sat in the living room, bloated with wine and praise, tossing around plans for Jessica's housewarming party like it was the next national holiday, I sat on the edge of the armchair nearest the hallway, silent and still, my phone in my hand. The weight of everything she'd ever confided in me sitting heavier than I'd let it sit before. Not because I'd suddenly become vindictive or cruel, but because, for the first time, I saw clearly that protecting her had never once meant she would protect me in return. She had always assumed I would stay in my place, the good sister, the understanding one, the emotional garbage disposal for everyone else's drama, but she never once stopped to think about the cost of being that person, of absorbing everyone else's messes while swallowing every moment that should have been mine. And I think that's what made it so easy for her to believe I'd never use what I knew, because the version of me she had built in her mind was someone safe, someone she didn't have to be afraid of, because I had never shown her otherwise. But she was wrong. That version of me was gone. I waited until the room quieted, until the music softened and the voices fell into that tired rhythm of post-dinner murmurs and second-glass vulnerability, and then, without making a sound, I tapped out a message, not dramatic, not confrontational, not even accusatory. Just a statement. One sentence. Specific, factual, undeniable. I mentioned the name of the coworker she had taken credit from, the real name of the report, and the fact that her resignation had come 3 days after the internal audit was announced. I didn't send it to my parents. I didn't leak it. I didn't blast it across the family group chat. I sent it to her, directly, privately, because the point wasn't to embarrass her in front of everyone. The point was to remind her that she wasn't untouchable, not with me. Not anymore. I put my phone down. I didn't look at it again. I just sat there, watching her from across the room as she laughed at something Dad said, holding a wine glass she didn't even realize was empty. It took exactly 48 seconds for her expression to change. She didn't scream. She didn't make a scene. She just glanced at her phone, blinked, read it again, and then looked up, not at Mom, Not at Dad, not at Connor, but at me. And I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I didn't move. I just looked back, and for the first time in our lives, she didn't know what to do with me. She made up some excuse about needing to help in the kitchen, and she followed me down the hall, all the way to the laundry room, which was the only room in the house without a window or an audience. She shut the door, not hard, but fast, and for a second we just stood there, two sisters, 3 years apart, who used to share a bunk bed and now stood on opposite sides of something much bigger than either of us had words for. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't angry. It was careful. "Why would you send that?" she asked, and I could hear the panic buried under the calm. "Why would you say that now?" And I looked at her, not the version of her I had carried in my head, not the big sister who was always loved more narrative I had let shape so much of my life, but the actual woman in front of me, the one who had used my loyalty like currency she never intended to repay, and I told her the truth. "Because I've spent years keeping your secrets while you let our parents believe I was the failure," I said, without raising my voice. "Because you let them toast you while I cleared their plates. Because I protected you, and you pretended I wasn't worth acknowledging. And now I just want you to remember I'm not invisible. Not to you." She didn't respond. She didn't argue or apologize. She just stood there, blinking like the words hadn't landed yet, like maybe if she didn't react, the moment wouldn't be real. But it was. It was the most real moment we'd ever had. I walked out before she could say anything else, and I didn't go back to the living room. I went upstairs to the guest room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, my phone still buzzing in my hand. I didn't need to look. I already knew what it would say. And sure enough, within minutes, her message came through. "Why is Mom crying in her room?" And I thought about all the things I could say in response, all the years of swallowed pride, all the milestones they ignored, all the loyalty I gave for free. But I didn't say any of it. I just let the message sit there unanswered, because sometimes silence isn't avoidance, sometimes it's the only way to make people finally hear you. That night, I didn't gloat. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't even feel angry anymore. What I felt was something closer to clarity, the quiet relief of stepping out of a story I was never written into, of finally taking my voice back without needing to raise it. Because for the first time, Jessica wasn't the center of the narrative. She was the one scrambling for control. And I was finally the one holding the script. I used to think that justice had to be loud, that if you wanted to be seen, to finally be heard, you needed to erupt, to disrupt the room, to cry or scream or demand acknowledgement in a way that couldn't be ignored. But what I realized that night, in the echo that followed Jessica's message and the quiet that settled over the house like a blanket soaked in tension, was that the most effective power doesn't always come from explosions or declarations, but from one perfectly timed shift in silence, a silence so sharp it cuts deeper than any raised voice ever could, and in that silence, people start to see not just the parts of you they had ignored, but the ways they had helped bury you without ever getting their hands dirty. Mom didn't come out of her room for a while, and no one said anything about it at first, not Jessica, not Dad, not Connor, because that's how our family operated. We did avoidance like other people did affection, and if something cracked, we just painted over it instead of asking why the foundation was shaking in the first place. But this time, the silence wasn't something I was part of. It wasn't mine to carry. It wasn't mine to fix. For once, I wasn't the one being asked to smooth things over or keep the peace or translate someone else's discomfort into something palatable. I just sat there in the guest room with my phone on the nightstand, untouched, unworried, unwilling to explain myself, because, frankly, they already knew. I didn't have to spell out what I had done, not because I was being vague, but because everyone in that house had been playing a game for years where the rules were designed to benefit Jessica and quietly exclude me, and now that I had disrupted it, they weren't confused, they were just shocked that I had finally stood up and flipped the board. And the beautiful thing about shock is that it makes people reconsider the stories they've been telling themselves. Mom wasn't crying because she found out something new, she was crying because deep down, she had probably always known there was a crack in the version of Jessica she had built up like some idealized monument, and what hurt wasn't the truth itself. But the realization that she had ignored the signs because it was easier to believe in the daughter who looked like success than to see the one who had always shown up, quietly and consistently, with nothing flashy to prove her worth. When Jessica knocked on my door the next morning, I expected her to come in swinging, to accuse, to deflect, to find some way to put the blame back on me, but instead, she stood in the hallway, arms crossed, eyes tired, voice low, and asked me a single question that told me everything I needed to know. "You told her, didn't you?" And I didn't nod. I didn't confirm. I didn't lie either. I just looked her in the eye and waited. And after a moment, she did something I hadn't seen her do since we were kids. She stepped back. Not physically. Emotionally. Like she finally understood that this version of me, the one who wasn't going to shield her anymore, the one who had stopped playing the role of the reliable, invisible sister, wasn't someone she could control. "She won't even look at me," she said, her voice cracking a little, not with guilt exactly, but with disbelief. She said she needed time to think. She asked me if I lied to her about other things. And maybe I should have felt sympathy. Maybe I should have softened. But the truth is, that moment wasn't about revenge for me. It wasn't about watching Jessica fall apart. It wasn't about making Mom feel bad or Dad feel foolish or even getting some overdue apology. What I felt, standing in that hallway, wasn't triumph or bitterness. It was peace, the kind that comes from no longer being afraid of what people might think of you once you stop making yourself small just to make them comfortable. I didn't tell her everything, I said finally, because I wanted her to know that there was still a line, that I hadn't burned the whole house down, only flicked a match to show them the cracks in the drywall. But I'm not going to protect your version of the story anymore. Not when it erases mine. Jessica didn't reply. She just nodded once, slowly, and walked away. No tears. No tantrums. Just the heavy realization that for once, the narrative was no longer hers to control. Later that day, when I packed my bag to leave earlier than planned, without the usual hugs or forced promises to do this again soon, no one tried to stop me. Mom didn't come out of her room. Dad avoided my gaze. Connor wasn't even around. And Jessica sat on the couch alone, scrolling through her phone like maybe the screen could offer her an escape from a house that suddenly felt too quiet. As I walked to my car, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel like I'd burned a bridge. What I felt was like I had finally built one, not to them, but away from them, towards something that felt solid and entirely mine. For years, I had begged silently, internally, almost subconsciously, for their recognition, for proof that I mattered, that I was more than the spare daughter, or the backup plan, or the designated listener. But I didn't need their recognition anymore. I didn't even want it. Because recognition built on false versions of people is just as hollow as the praise they used to give Jessica, loud, impressive, but ultimately empty. In the end, I didn't win by taking something from her. I won by taking something back for myself, my story, my voice, my place at a table I no longer cared to sit at. They can keep their toasts and their picture frames and their nostalgia for the version of the family they always preferred to believe in. I'll take the truth, sharp, clean, and finally mine.